So today we will be talking about the potential GDP, the output gap, and the Alkin's law. First of all, let's take a look what is a potential GDP. So basically, potential GDP is an economy's maximum ideal production with high employment across all sectors and maintaining currency and product price stability. In a short word, we can say that the potential GDP is the ideal GDP that we can achieve. So we usually use Y to represent the actual GDP and YP to represent potential GDP in the formula that we will be using that in the next few slides. So let's move on to the next part, which is the output gap. So the output gap is an economic measure of the difference between the actual output of an economy and its potential output. So the first one, we got zero output gap, and we can see that from the graph, which is the spot between the blue area and the red area. So it represents that the actual GDP and the potential GDP is the same. And then we have the positive output gap, which is the blue area, which means that the real GDP is higher than potential GDP. So in this case, it usually comes with some inflation and overheating, and something like that. And then we have negative output gap, which is a recession, which is also the red area in this graph, which means that the real GDP is below the potential GDP, and it comes with some recession. And suppose if you are a worker, you probably will have lower income, you probably will lose your jobs, and for business, they will decline their sales or go bankrupt. Here's a formula for the output gap, which is the real GDP minus potential GDP or potential GDP. Here's another concept, which is cyclical unemployment. So this is a component of overall unemployment that results directly from cycles of economic upturn and downturn. And unemployment typically rise during recessions and decline during economic expansion. So here's the formula for that, which is U minus UN. Next, we will be talking about Alkin's law. So Alkin's law was postulated by Yale professor and economist Arthur Alkin in the early 1960s. And Alkin's law looks at statistical relationship between a country's unemployment and output gap. So here's a graph for the Alkin's law, and we can clearly say that there's a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and the output gap. Which means that if the output gap is positive, then the actual unemployment rate will be lower, and vice versa. If the output gap is negative, which means that unemployment rate is higher. So combine this concept with the previous concept that we talked about. When the real GDP is higher than potential GDP, which means that the output gap is positive, which means that the unemployment rate will be lower, and vice versa. So here's the formula for that, and we will be using this formula in the next slide and to solve a example. So here's an example for that. Suppose that potential GDP in a small country is 11,500 in year 1, and the real GDP is 13,600. Potential GDP grows at a rate of 6% per year. Using Alkin's law, determine the cyclical unemployment rate in the small country. What is the cyclical rate of the unemployment in year 1? Assume Alkin's law coefficient, which is H, is 0.5. So first of all, we need to calculate the output gap, which is the real GDP minus potential GDP over potential GDP times 100%, which is 18% approximately. And we also know that the coefficient, which is H, which is 0.5, it usually comes with negative relationship, so we can see that here's a negative sign in the formula, which means that in the end, the formula calculate the result from the formula is negative 0.5 times 18%, which is negative 9.13%.